The dining room of the Lim estate had 32 chairs. Mariella Thomas knew this because she had counted them on her third day in the household, the way she cataloged everything in spaces where she was not entirely sure of her welcome. 32 chairs around a table of polished dark elm that reflected the chandelier above it like a still lake. 32 chairs, and on the evening of the quarterly family dinner, 27 of them were occupied by people who belonged there by blood, by alliance, or by the specific authority that came from being invited. Mariella had not been invited. She had been tolerated. She understood the difference. She had always understood the difference. She was standing at the far end of the room, near the serving corridor, because that was where Madame Suja Lim had positioned her at the start of the evening with a look that required no translation. Not at the table, near the wall, visible enough to be summoned, invisible enough to be denied. She had been standing there for 40 minutes when 6-year-old Jiho, seated 3 chairs from the head of the table, turned around and found her with his eyes the way he always found her, with the uncomplicated certainty of a child who has decided that a particular person is his. He patted the empty chair beside him. His face said everything his vocabulary hadn't yet learned to contain. Mariella shook her head gently. She smiled to soften it. She mouthed, later. Jiho's face disagreed. Madame Suja, who missed nothing that happened at her table, turned to follow her grandson's gaze. She found Mariella. Her expression arranged itself into the specific configuration it reserved for things she considered beneath the dignity of acknowledgement and yet felt compelled to address. She can eat in the kitchen, Madame Suja said. Not quietly, not to anyone in particular, to the room. That is where the help belongs. She is far too dark to be sitting at this table. She returned to her soup. It would put everyone off their food. The table went still. 27 people suddenly found their plates very interesting. Mariella did not move. She had learned, in 27 years of being the person in rooms who was told in various registers and various vocabularies that she was too much of something or not enough of something else, how to stand inside a moment of public cruelty without letting it reach the part of her that mattered. Her face was composed. Her hands were still. Her spine was exactly as straight as it had been before those words were spoken. She was already deciding, quietly, how many days of notice she was required to give. And then Sang-Yun Lim put down his chopsticks. The sound was small, almost nothing. But in the particular silence that had settled over that dining room, it was the loudest thing that had happened all evening. Because Sang-Yun Lim did not make small sounds. He made decisions. And every person at that table had spent enough time in his company to know the difference between the two. He stood. He pushed back his chair with the measured deliberateness of a man who has decided something and is in no hurry to be misunderstood. He crossed the room in 8 steps. He stopped beside the empty chair at the head of the table. His chair, the one nobody else sat in. The seat that represented in the architecture of this room everything that he was and everything that he had inherited and built. And he pulled it out. He looked at Mariella. "Sit down," he said. She looked at the chair, then at him. The entire table was watching. "Sang-Yun," his mother began. "Sit down, Mariella," he said again. Quieter this time, which in his language meant more certain, not less. She sat. He remained standing until she was settled. Then he returned to his own seat, 3 chairs down from the head, which was now hers, picked up his chopsticks, and resumed his meal as if nothing had happened and everything had changed simultaneously. Madame Suja's soup went cold. Jiho beamed across the table at Mariella with the total satisfaction of a child whose world had just been correctly arranged. And Mariella sat at the head of a table she had never been invited to, in a household she had entered through a door that was not the front one, and understood with absolute clarity that whatever she had thought this job was going to be, it was no longer that. She came to take care of a child. She did not come to sit at the head of a table that the most feared man in Seoul just gave her in front of his entire family. Sang-Yun Lim did not do impulsive things. He did not make gestures. He made statements. And what he said tonight, without a single word about his mother, without a scene, without anything except a pulled-out chair, is going to change this household in ways that nobody at that table is prepared for. Subscribe right now, because this story did not begin at that dinner table. It began 20 years ago. with a woman named Clara Thomas. And a secret that Madame Suja Lim has been keeping since before Mariella was old enough to know what secrets cost. There are households in the world that are not homes. They are architectures of power, buildings arranged to communicate hierarchy before a word is spoken, to remind everyone inside them of their position relative to everyone else. The Lim estate in the Songbuk district of Seoul was one of those architectures. It had 4 floors, 11 rooms, a walled garden that required 2 full-time groundskeepers, and a silence inside it that was not peaceful but pressurized, the silence of a place where people were careful. Mariella Thomas had grown up hearing about it. Not about this specific house. The Lim family had moved to the Songbuk estate 7 years ago, when Sang Yoon's position in the organization had consolidated enough to require a residential address that communicated permanence and authority. But about the household, about the family, about the specific quality of living under Madame Suja Lim's roof, where a woman named Clara Thomas had spent 3 years as domestic staff in a previous Seoul address, 2 decades ago, when Sang Yoon was still a teenager and his father Dae-sung Lim was alive and the family's world was arranged differently. Clara Thomas had been Mariella's mother. She had died 3 years ago in a hospital in South London, holding her daughter's hand and talking, as she sometimes did in her final weeks, about Seoul. About the cold winters and the particular smell of John frying on Sunday mornings and a garden in Jongno, where she had sometimes been allowed to sit in the evenings after her work was finished. About a man named Chairman Lim who had given her his wife's umbrella on a rainy morning without being asked and had never once spoken to her, as though she were anything other than a person of consequence. About a woman who had made her feel the opposite of that every single day for 3 years. Mariella had listened to all of it. She had filed it with the careful, organized attention she brought to everything, which her mother had said was a gift and her university professors had said was exceptional, and which Mariella herself understood as something simpler. She paid attention to things because she had learned early that information was the only resource that was always available to her regardless of what else was not. When the listing appeared on an international nanny placement service 14 months ago, Lim household, Songbuk-gu, Seoul, 1 child aged 6, live-in position, immediate start. Mariella had stared at it for a long time. She had a qualification in child development from the University of Edinburgh. She had 4 years of professional experience. She had 3 other offers that were better compensated and less complicated. She had accepted the Lim position. She had her mother's stories. She had her own questions. And she had a particular feeling about Ji-ho Lim, the 6-year-old whose photograph on the placement agency's profile showed a small boy with serious eyes and a cautious smile, standing in a garden beside a rosebush that was taller than he was. He had looked, in that photograph, like a child who needed someone to be reliably, unconditionally present. Mariella Thomas understood that particular need. She packed her bags and booked her flight. She had not planned on the dinner. She had not planned on the chair. She had not planned on any of what came after. But then, the most important things rarely arrive according to plan. She arrived on a Tuesday in October through the service entrance, because that was what the instructions from the placement agency specified. The household manager, a precise woman in her 50s named Eun Seo, met her at the door with a printed schedule, a ring of keys, and the particular efficiency of someone who had been managing complicated households for long enough to have dispensed with preliminaries. She showed Mariella her room on the 3rd floor, clean, well-furnished, with a window that looked out over the walled garden, and walked her through the daily structure with the brisk thoroughness of someone who understood that clarity at the beginning prevented confusion later. Ji-ho's routine, meal times, nap schedule for when he had been particularly active, the names of his teachers at the international school on Bukhansanaro, his 3 non-negotiable requirements: no loud noises before he had eaten breakfast, always knock before entering his room, and never, under any circumstances, move his rock collection from the windowsill where he arranged it each morning. Mariella committed all of it to memory without writing anything down, which made Eun Seo pause for a moment and look at her with a recalibrated expression that was the closest thing to approval she would offer for several weeks. "Madam Lim," Eun Seo said, At the end of the orientation, with the careful neutrality of someone choosing their words inside a minefield, takes breakfast in her private sitting room and dinner at the family table. She has preferences about the household's presentation and the conduct of staff within shared spaces. A pause. She will communicate those preferences herself. Another pause. In her own time. Mariella understood everything that was not said. She met Jiho that afternoon. He was sitting in the garden with his back against the tall rosebush from the photograph, sorting pebbles into categories that were not immediately apparent to anyone except him. He looked up when Mariella came through the garden door, assessed her for a long silent moment with the unfiltered evaluative honesty that 6-year-olds bring to everything, and then looked back at his pebbles. "You're not Korean," he said. "No," Mariella said. "I'm British." She sat down on the low stone bench near him without asking if it was all right, because she had learned that children who were suspicious of adults were often more comfortable with adults who didn't perform comfort. "What are the categories?" she asked, nodding at the pebbles. A pause. "By how old they are," he said. "How can you tell?" He considered whether to answer. Then, "The color gets lighter when they're older, because the sun takes things out of them." He picked up a pale gray stone and turned it over. "This one is very old." He set it down precisely. "My father says things that are very old have earned the right to be treated carefully." Mariella looked at the pale gray stone. "Your father is right," she said. Jiho looked at her again. The assessment this time was different. Something had shifted. "You can sit here if you want," he said. "But don't move the categories." "I won't," she said. She sat in the garden with Jiho for an hour that afternoon, and she understood by the end of it two things. This child was serious and perceptive, and had been moving through his days in a household where the adults around him were too occupied with their own arrangements to fully meet him. And she had been right to come. She met Sang-Yun Lim for the first time 3 days later. He came home at 7 in the evening, which Eun Seo had noted was early for him, and he went directly to Jiho's room, which Mariella knew because she heard his footsteps on the third-floor corridor and then heard Jiho's voice change register in the way it did when something important had arrived. She was in the sitting room adjacent to Jiho's room, reviewing the school's weekly learning plan, when Sang-Yun passed the open doorway. He stopped. She stood. He was taller than she had expected from the limited information she had assembled about the household before arriving. He was wearing a dark suit that had the specific quality of clothing that is expensive without advertising the fact. He looked at her with eyes that did not perform assessment, but simply performed it, efficiently, completely, without commentary. "You're the new nanny," he said. "Mariella Thomas," she said. "I started Tuesday." He nodded once. "Jiho spoke well of you." A pause that was not awkward, but was deliberate. "That doesn't happen quickly with him. He's a careful person," Mariella said. Something shifted in Sang-Yun's expression. Not warmth exactly. Something more considered than warmth. Precision, maybe, the recognition of an accurate statement. "Yes," he said. "He is." He moved on down the corridor. That was their first conversation. 43 words between them, and the whole shape of what was to come already present in the room, though neither of them could have named it yet. Madame Suja Lim arrived in Mariella's experience not all at once, but in layers, the way bad weather arrives. First a change in atmospheric pressure, then a quality of light, then the thing itself. The atmospheric pressure was the way Eun Seo moved differently on the mornings Madame Suja came down early. The quality of light was the way the household staff found peripheral tasks in other rooms. The thing itself was Madame Suja in the ground floor sitting room at 9:30 on Mariella's 5th morning, dressed impeccably in a pale gray ensemble that communicated effortless authority, holding a porcelain teacup and regarding Mariella's entrance into the room with the expression of someone who has already conducted a trial and returned a verdict. "You are the British girl," she said. "Yes, Madame Lim," Mariella said. "My son hired you without consulting me." Mariella said nothing. This was not a question. "Jiho requires continuity," Madame Suja continued. "He has had 3 nannies in 2 years. I advised my son that the instability is not healthy for the child. He disagrees. He believes the previous nannies left because of the hours." She looked at Mariella over the rim of her teacup. "They did not leave because of the hours." Again, Mariella waited. Jiho's mother died when he was 3, Madame Suja said. Her tone did not change when she said it. It was the tone of a woman reporting a fact that had been processed and filed and no longer required the accommodation of emotion. He is a sensitive child. He attaches quickly and suffers when attachments are disrupted. The women who left understood this and left anyway, which tells you something about the kind of women they were. She set down her teacup. I will be watching to see what kind of woman you are. That's reasonable, Mariella said. Madame Suja looked at her. The response had not been what she anticipated, which Mariella could tell from the slight recalibration in her posture. A woman who expected either deference or anxiety and had received neither. You may go, Madame Suja said. Mariella went. The weeks that followed established the pattern. Madame Suja moved through the household with the authority of someone who had built her identity around being the most important person in every room she entered, and she communicated her assessments of Mariella with the specific instrument she had clearly refined across decades. She spoke about Mariella in rooms where Mariella was present, to other people, in Korean, as though Mariella were a piece of furniture that could neither understand nor object. She commented on Mariella's hair to Unseo while Mariella was setting Jiho's breakfast table. She observed to a visiting relative that she had never understood why British families sent their cast-offs abroad. She noted, loudly, one afternoon when Mariella was in the garden with Jiho, that the child was spending too much time with someone who had nothing to teach him. Mariella understood Korean. She had learned it from her mother's stories and supplemented it methodically in the 6 months before arriving in Seoul, until she could follow conversation at native speed without effort. She had not disclosed this to anyone in the Lim household. Not yet. She processed each of Madame Suja's comments with the stillness she had cultivated since childhood, the ability to absorb something painful without letting it alter her posture, her expression, or her concentration on the thing directly in front of her, which was always Jiho. Jiho, who was 6 and perceptive and had been watching the adults in his household with the quietly alarmed attention of a child who understands more than anyone has told him, noticed everything. He did not have the vocabulary to name what he noticed, but he knew that his grandmother said things that made Mariella go still, and he knew that Mariella stayed anyway. And he had decided, in the private economy of a child's loyalty, that staying anyway was the thing that mattered most. He started leaving the best pebbles on her windowsill. She arranged them carefully and never moved them. Madame Suja has been narrating her disapproval of Mariella Thomas in Korean for 6 weeks. In Korean, in rooms where Mariella is standing. Mariella speaks Korean. She has spoken Korean since before she landed in Seoul. She has understood every single word. Subscribe and stay right here, because Mariella has been very patient. And the quarterly family dinner is in 3 days. And Sang-Yun Lim has just asked Unseo to set a place at the table for the nanny. His mother does not know this yet. Sang-Yun Lim had built his life on the principle that people revealed themselves completely if you gave them enough time and sufficient space and withheld the thing they most wanted, which was your reaction. His mother had taught him this, ironically, not through instruction but through example. Watching Suja Lim manage a room had taught him, by the age of 14, that most people could not sustain a performance indefinitely, and that the moment they stopped performing was the moment you understood who they actually were. He had been watching Mariella Thomas for 6 weeks. What he had observed: she arrived at Jiho's room each morning 2 minutes before the schedule required, never 1 minute and never 3, which told him she was precise, but not rigid. She spoke to Jiho in a register that was neither the simplified vocabulary some caregivers used with children nor the overcomplicated language of adults who wanted to be admired for treating children as equals. She spoke to him at the level he was actually at, which shifted daily as she recalibrated. She had reorganized Jiho's study corner without being asked in a way that created better light and better access to the materials he used most. And she had done it on a Thursday evening when Jiho was at school, and she had not mentioned it to anyone. Jiho had walked in on Friday morning, stopped, looked at the corner for a long time, and then looked at Mariella with an expression Sang-Yun had not seen on his son's face in 3 years. The expression of a child who has registered that someone was paying attention. He had watched this on the household camera feed late on Friday night. He had also watched, on a different evening, his mother in the ground-floor sitting room speaking to Uncio. He had watched Mariella's back. She was arranging Jiho's school bag near the corridor entrance, facing away from his mother, and he had watched the quality of Mariella's stillness while his mother spoke. It was not the stillness of someone who did not understand. He had been reading people's stillness for 20 years. It was the stillness of someone who understood perfectly and had decided, in real time, not to respond. He had sat with that for a long time. His mother's management of household staff was not a new problem. It was an old one that he had addressed 3 times in 14 years with diminishing patience and consistent ineffectiveness, because Suja Lim was the only person in his world who operated entirely outside his authority, and they both knew it. She was not afraid of him. She was his mother, which meant she occupied a category in his internal hierarchy that his operational code had no mechanism for overriding. He could remove a lieutenant who crossed a line. He could restructure an arrangement that was no longer functional. He could not, within the framework of who he was and what he believed, treat his mother as a problem to be solved. What he could do was make specific, visible statements. He spoke to Uncio on the Tuesday before the quarterly family dinner. "Set a place for Mariella at the family table," he said. Uncio looked at him with the expression of someone absorbing both the instruction and its implications simultaneously. "Yes," she said. "Does she know?" "I'll inform her this evening." "Good." He paused. "Tell her it's not a request." Uncio nodded. There was, in the careful economy of her expression, something that might have been satisfaction. Sang-Yun went back to his work. He did not examine too closely why he had made this particular decision. He told himself it was operational, staff morale, household cohesion, the stability of Jiho's environment. All of those things were true. None of them were the complete truth. The complete truth was something he filed in the category of things that were not yet urgent and therefore did not require immediate attention. He was beginning to understand that some things did not wait for the category to open. The quarterly family dinner of the Lim household was not a warm occasion. It was a demonstration, an assembly of the family's various branches, uncles and cousins and affiliated connections who occupied the outer rings of the Lim organization's social architecture, at a table that communicated, through its scale and its precision and the quality of everything on it, the standing of the family at its center. Madame Suja had presided over these dinners for 30 years. She knew their choreography precisely. She knew who sat where and why and what it communicated and what happened to people who disrupted the arrangement. She had not been informed that a place had been set for the nanny until she entered the dining room. Mariella was already there, near the serving corridor, because Uncio had conveyed Sang-Yun's instruction with the caveat that it was possible the evening would be complicated and that Mariella should be present from the beginning. Mariella had dressed carefully, not elaborately, but carefully, in a deep green dress that was appropriate to the occasion without being a performance. She had learned this calibration from her mother, who had understood that there were rooms in the world where you needed to be dressed well enough that your presence could not be attributed to oversight, but not so well that it could be attributed to presumption. Jiho had seen her from the doorway, and his face had done the thing it always did, which was to rearrange itself into unguarded happiness. He had found his seat and immediately begun patting the empty chair beside him. She had shaken her head. She had mouthed, "Later." She had not known, at that moment, how literal later would be. The dinner proceeded for 40 minutes before the incident. The first courses were served. Conversations moved in the overlapping currents of a large family gathering: business, children, property, the specific political economy of who was thriving and who was not. Sang-Yun sat at the head of the table and spoke rarely and listened with the focused attention that made the people he was listening to feel both seen and slightly examined. He had not looked at Mariella directly since the evening began. She had noticed this. She had also noticed that he had positioned himself in a way that gave him a clear sight line to where she stood. When Madame Suja spoke, it was with the precision of a woman who had been constructing the sentence for some time and had decided that 40 minutes was the appropriate delay before delivery. "She can eat in the kitchen," she said, into a momentary lull in the conversation around her. Her voice was measured. Conversational, almost. "That is where the help belongs." She is far too dark to be sitting at this table. A beat. It would put everyone off their food. The silence that followed was the specific silence of 27 people simultaneously choosing not to be the one who responded. Mariella did not move. She absorbed the sentence the way she had absorbed every sentence Madame Suja had delivered in the preceding 6 weeks, into the composed, organized stillness that was not indifference, but its own kind of power. She was already, in the back of her mind, running a calculation. How many days of notice? Whether Ji-ho would understand. What she would say to him. Then Sang-yoon put down his chopsticks. One small sound. Into a very large silence. He stood. The movement was unhurried. He was not angry. Or if he was, it was the cold, focused kind that in his world was considerably more significant than hot anger, because it meant a decision had been made rather than a reaction had been had. He crossed to the head of the table. His own seat. The chair that was the architectural center of this room's entire hierarchy. He pulled it out. He looked at Mariella. Across the room. Past his mother. Past the 27 assembled members of his family and organization. Past every calculation about what this meant and what it would cost. Sit down, he said. The room did not breathe. Sang-in, his mother began, and her voice had the particular quality of a woman who understood that something was happening that she could not reverse but had not yet accepted that it was beyond her. Sit down, Mariella, he said. Quieter. Final. She walked across that room. She was aware of every eye on her. She was aware of Ji-ho's face, bright and certain, and of Eun-seo in the serving corridor doorway with her hands folded and her expression carefully neutral. She was aware of Madame Suja, very still, very upright, her teacup halfway to her lips. She sat down. Sang-yoon remained standing until she was settled, a formal, deliberate courtesy that communicated in the language of this household and this family and this world exactly what he intended it to communicate. Then he returned to his own chair, 3 seats down from the head, and picked up his chopsticks and said to the cousin on his left, "You were saying something about the Mapo property." The dinner resumed. It resumed because when Sang-yoon Lim decided something was over, it was over. That was one of the fundamental operating principles of this household. Everyone at that table understood it. They understood also what had just happened and what it meant, and that its implications extended considerably beyond a single chair. Madame Suja's soup went cold. She did not touch it again. Across the table, Ji-ho quietly slid his best pebble, the old gray one, the one that had earned the right to be treated carefully, from his pocket and placed it discreetly beside Mariella's chopsticks. She looked at it. She looked at him. He looked back with the absolute, uncomplicated conviction of a child who has decided that things are exactly as they should be. Red Circle Suspense CTA, 27 people just watched Sang-yoon Lim give his own share to his nanny. In front of his mother. In front of his entire organization. Madame Suja has been the authority in this household for 30 years. Not one person at that table has ever seen her overruled at her own dinner table. What she does next will determine whether this household survives intact. And what Sang-yoon does next will determine something far more dangerous. Subscribe and stay right here, because what happens after that dinner ends is only half the story. The other half is what Mariella finds in a box on the 4th floor. And it has her mother's name on it. The guests left by 10. They left with the particular efficiency of people who understand that a household has experienced a seismic event and that the appropriate response is to remove themselves from the radius before the aftershocks begin. There were the standard courtesies, thank yous and bows, and the small social performances of departure, but they were compressed, expedited, stripped of the usual lingering. Within 40 minutes of the final course, the Lim estate had emptied of everyone except the people who lived there. Mariella put Ji-ho to bed. He was unusually talkative, the way children become talkative when they have experienced something large and need to process it through language. He told her about a book he was reading. He asked her whether she thought pebbles could feel temperature changes or whether they just conducted them without awareness. He asked her, after a pause that had the particular weight of something he had been building toward, whether she was going to stay. "What makes you ask that?" she said. "The others left when grandmother was like that," he said. He said it without drama, which was more affecting than drama would have been. Just a fact, assembled from observation, stored by a 6-year-old who had been quietly tracking the pattern. She looked at him for a moment, at his serious face and his pale gray pebble, which he had reclaimed from the dinner table and was turning over in his fingers. "I'm staying," she said. "Because of me?" he said. "Partly," she said, "and partly because I haven't finished what I came here to do." He considered this with the thoroughness he brought to everything. Then he put the pebble on her side of the windowsill, which was a declaration in the private language they had developed, and he went to sleep. She closed his door. She stood in the corridor. Down the hall, a line of light showed under Seung-yoon's study door. She could hear nothing. He was always quiet when he was working. He was almost always working. She went to her own room. She sat at the small desk beside the window, and she looked at the walled garden below, which was silver and still in the autumn night, and she thought about her mother. About Clara Thomas, who had stood in corridors not unlike this one, 20 years ago, and absorbed things not unlike what Madame Suja had said tonight, and had stayed anyway because she needed the work, and because there was a man in this household who treated her with dignity, and because dignity, her mother had told her, was not something you carried into rooms. It was something you found in rooms, sometimes, if you looked for the right person. She thought about the things her mother had never finished telling her. The things that had gotten lost in the final weeks, when the pain medication made the sentences come out incomplete and the connections between thoughts were no longer reliable. The things that had felt, sometimes, like they were leading somewhere her mother never quite arrived. There was a knock at her door. She stood. Yes. Unseo opened the door. She was holding a tray, tea, which she set on the desk with a practicality that was its own form of kindness. She straightened. She looked at Mariella with an expression that had moved, over the past 6 weeks, from assessment to something warmer and less defined. "You should know," Unseo said, "that what he did tonight has not happened before. In 14 years of these dinners. He has never," she paused, choosing precision, "he has never made a statement of that kind at that table." Mariella said nothing. "I wanted you to understand the weight of it," Unseo said, "so that you understand what staying means. It will not make things easier with Madame Lim. It will make them considerably more difficult." "I know," Mariella said. Unseo looked at her for a moment longer. "Your mother worked for this family," she said. "I was here then. I was very junior. But I remember her." She paused. She was a good woman. The room rearranged itself around those words. Mariella felt something shift behind her sternum. Not pain, but the particular feeling of something that has been held in suspension for a long time beginning to move. "You knew her?" Mariella said. "I knew of her," Unseo said carefully. "Chairman Lim, Seung-yoon's father, he valued her. More than was typical." Another pause. "There were things left unresolved when she left. I have thought about that. Over the years." She straightened again. "Get some rest. Tomorrow will be a long day." She moved to the door. Stopped. "There is a storage room on the 4th floor. 3rd door on the left. The chairman's personal effects are there. Things Madame Lim never sorted through after his death." She did not look at Mariella when she said this. "I mention it for no particular reason." She left. Mariella sat with her tea in the particular charged silence of a room that has just been given a direction without being given an explanation. 3rd door on the left. 4th floor. She drank her tea. She waited until the house was fully quiet. And then she went upstairs. The 4th floor of the Lim estate was used for storage and had the specific quality of spaces that accumulate the things people cannot bring themselves to discard but cannot bear to keep visible. Boxes. Covered furniture. The particular archaeology of a life that had ended and left its physical residue behind to be managed by people who were still living. The 3rd door on the left opened into a room that smelled of cedar and old paper. There was a single window, shuttered. Mariella turned on the small lamp near the door and waited for her eyes to adjust. The room was orderly in the way that Unseo's management of everything was orderly, organized not for access but for preservation. Boxes labeled in Korean in a handwriting she recognized from the household's older documents as Chairman Lim's. Personal correspondence. Business records. Photographs. She moved through the room slowly, not searching exactly, following the particular instinct she had inherited from her mother, who had believed that spaces held the character of the people who had arranged them, and that if you moved through them carefully enough, you could understand something true. She found the box in the far corner. It was smaller than the others. Dark green, water-damaged at one corner, tied with a string that had been knotted and unknotted and re-knotted several times over the years. On the lid, in Chairman Lim's handwriting, were 2 words. She could read them. They said, Clara Thomas. She stood very still for a long time. Then she sat down on the floor of that dusty room, and she opened the box, and she read. There were letters. 7 of them, written in English in the careful, considered hand of a man for whom English was a second language, and who therefore chose each word with particular deliberateness. They were dated across a period of 3 years, the 3 years her mother had worked in the Lim household. They were not love letters. They were something more complicated and in some ways more significant than love letters. They were letters between 2 people who had recognized in each other a quality of seriousness and care that their respective circumstances had not given them many opportunities to find. Chairman Lim Dae-sung had seen Clara Thomas, not as staff, not as domestic help, as a person of intelligence and dignity who was moving through difficult circumstances with a grace he found, as he wrote in the 4th letter, instructive. He had written to her, not in the household, but separately, through a postal arrangement, because he understood that correspondence of this kind required discretion about his son, about Sang-yeon, then 16, then 17, then 18, the boy who was going to inherit a world that Dae-sung was not entirely proud of and could not entirely change. He had written to Clara about what he hoped for that boy, what he feared for him, what he believed he needed, which was someone in his life who understood that power and goodness were not mutually exclusive and who would hold him to both. The 7th letter was different from the others. It was addressed not to Clara but to her daughter. It was dated 14 years ago. Mariella would have been 13 at the time. She read it twice, then a 3rd time. Chairman Lim Dae-sung had known, when he wrote it, that he was dying. The language had the quality of a man making final arrangements, final accountings. He had known, somehow, through Clara's own letters, which were referenced but not present in the box, that Clara had a daughter. He had known her name. He had written to Mariella Thomas, age 13, care of her mother, a letter that Clara had apparently never delivered. The letter said, I have watched your mother move through this world with more dignity than most people manage with every advantage. Whatever she has given you is worth more than anything in this house. My son will need, one day, someone who can show him the difference between authority and cruelty. Your mother showed me that difference every day for 3 years. I do not know if you will ever find your way to his world. I suspect you might. If you do, I want you to know that you were always welcome at this table. You were always supposed to be here. The date on the letter was the year before Chairman Lim died. Madame Suja, who managed the household correspondence after his health declined, had received and not delivered it. Mariella sat on the floor of the 4th floor storage room of the Lim estate and held the letter her mother had never seen, written to her by a man she had never met, and understood something she had not fully understood before. She had not come to Seoul because of the Nanny listing. She had not come because of a feeling about Jiho's photograph. She had not come because of her mother's stories, not exactly. She had come because Chairman Lim Dae-sung had spent 14 years being right about her without her knowledge. And his son, who did not yet know any of this, had spent 6 weeks confirming it. She put the letters back in the box. She tied the string. She sat for a while longer in the quiet of that cedar-scented room, with her mother's name on a box in her lap, and let herself feel the full weight of what had just shifted. Then she heard footsteps on the 4th floor stairs. Chairman Lim Dae-sung wrote Mariella Thomas a letter when she was 13 years old. He told her she was always welcome at his table. His wife intercepted it and never delivered it. His son, who knows none of this yet, just gave Mariella his own seat at that same table 14 years later. The man has been right about her for his entire adult life without knowing her name. Subscribe right now, because the footsteps on those stairs belong to Sang-yeon. And in approximately 90 seconds, Mariella Thomas is going to have to decide how much of this box she is ready to explain. Sang-yeon stood in the doorway of the storage room for a moment before he spoke. He took in the scene with the completeness he brought to all visual information. Mariella on the floor, the cedar-smelling room, the green box in her lap with her hands flat on the lid, the lamp throwing its small circle of light into the larger dark. He registered all of it. He did not register it with alarm. There was something in his expression that was closer to recognition, as though he had walked into a room and found something he had been vaguely looking for without knowing it. "Uncio," he said. Not a question, a conclusion. "Yes," Mariella said. He came into the room. He did not sit. He stood with his back against the wall opposite her, his arms at his sides, in the posture she had come to understand as his resting configuration, present, contained, ready. "What's in the box?" he said. She looked at the box, at her hands on the lid, at the two words in his father's handwriting that she had been looking at for the past hour. She turned it to face him. He read the name. She watched his face. She had learned his face over 6 weeks, had learned which movements were significant and which were the ordinary surface-level expressions of daily navigation. What happened when he read those two words was significant. Something went very still in him, and then something moved, and then the stillness returned, but it was a different stillness than before. Heavier, more considered. "Your mother," he said. "She worked here," Mariella said. 20 years ago. For your father." A pause. "I know," he said. She looked up at him. "I was 16 when she left," he said. "I remembered her. She used to leave books on the kitchen table. Korean books, not English ones. She was learning the language." He paused. "My father gave her his dictionary. She used to sit at the kitchen table and work through it in the evenings." He said it was the most dedicated thing he had ever seen. Mariella closed her eyes for a moment. Her mother, at a kitchen table, working through a Korean dictionary in the evenings. The same mother who had taught her daughter Korean from those same evenings, from those same words, from the specific vocabulary of this household. She opened the box. She took out the 7th letter. She held it out to him. He took it. He read it. She watched him read it, and she watched the same process she had gone through happen in him. The first reading for information, the second for meaning, and then the long pause before he looked up that was not the pause of someone processing, but of someone deciding what to say about what they had processed. "He knew you were coming," Sang-yin said. "He suspected," Mariella said. "He wrote to a 13-year-old girl and told her she was welcome at his table. He didn't know I'd actually arrive. He was making space for the possibility. My mother received this," he said. "Yes." "And didn't deliver it." "No." He was quiet for a long time. Long enough for the house to settle around them in the way old houses settle at night, making the small sounds of a structure at rest. "Why did you come?" he said. "You knew the family name. You could have made contact through other means. Through lawyers, through formal channels. You didn't have to walk in through the service entrance." "I needed to see," she said. "The same reason I suspect your father wrote letters instead of making formal arrangements. Because formal arrangements tell you what people do when they know they're being observed. I needed to know what you did when you thought nobody important was watching." He looked at her. "And," he said, "you went to Jiho's room first every evening," she said. "Before anything else. Before calls, before briefings, before food. Him first. Every time." She paused. "You gave Yuna in the kitchen a pay increase after you watched her stay 2 hours past her shift to help the new delivery staff learn the inventory system. You never told her you noticed. You just adjusted her pay. No conversation, no acknowledgement. Just the act." Another pause. "And tonight you stood up and pulled out your own chair and gave it to someone your mother had just told to eat in the kitchen." She looked at him directly. "Your father was right about you. That's why I stayed." The quality of silence in that storage room was unlike any silence that had existed in the Lim household in the preceding 6 weeks. It was not pressurized. It was not careful. It was the silence of two people inside a moment that was too large for either of them to move quickly within. Sang-yin looked at his father's letter for a long time. "He left the box here deliberately," he said finally. "He would have known my mother would control the household correspondence. He would have known she'd intercept anything addressed to your mother." He turned the letter over. He left the box on the 4th floor knowing that whoever sorted his effects would find it. He was making sure it survived until it could find the right person. He looked up. "He was waiting for you to come here and find it yourself." Mariella had not thought of this. She thought of it now. Dae-sung Lim, in his final months, arranging things, not for his own satisfaction, but for a future he wouldn't be present in, trusting that the right person would arrive at the right time. He was very patient, she said. He always was, Sang-yun said. Something in his voice, when he said it, was not simple. It was the tone of a man who had loved his father and missed him and was, in this specific moment, feeling both of those things at once. Mariella put the letters back in the box. Carefully. All 7 of them. In the order she had found them. She stood. They were standing 3 feet apart in a cedar-smelling room on the 4th floor of a house that had, in the past 2 hours, reorganized itself around information that had been waiting 14 years to arrive. Outside, Seoul maintained its indifferent illumination. There is a problem, Sang-yun said. She waited. My mother, he said. What I did at dinner tonight. She won't accept it quietly. She will move. I don't know when or how, but she will. And now that I know why you're here, now that there's history between our families that she has already demonstrated she's willing to suppress, she has more reason to act, not less. He looked at her steadily. I want you to understand the situation you are in. I've understood it since the first morning she spoke about me in Korean while I was standing in the room, Mariella said. He paused. You speak Korean. Fluently, she said. I learned it from my mother. Who learned it from your father's dictionary? She paused. At the kitchen table. The silence was shorter this time. He processed it faster. How long have you understood everything she's been saying? He said. Since the first morning. She met his eyes. I've been very patient. Something moved through Sang-yun Lim's expression. Something that started as surprise and moved through something she could not immediately name and arrived, quietly, at the beginning of something she was not ready to name yet, and suspected he wasn't either. He almost smiled. It was brief and real and directed at the floor rather than at her, as though he were keeping it private even from himself. My father, he said quietly, to the floor, would have liked you enormously. I know, she said. He wrote it down. The morning after the dinner, Madame Suja did not come down to breakfast. This was unprecedented in the 14 years that Eun Seo had managed the household, and she communicated the fact to Sang-yun with the economical gravity of a woman who understands that the absence of a habitual thing is more informative than the presence of an unusual one. He nodded. He ate his breakfast. He went to his office. Jiho came to breakfast in his school uniform with 3 pebbles lined up on his palm for Mariella to assess. She assessed each one with the seriousness the ritual required, confirmed that the middle one was the oldest by a significant margin, and sent him to school with the specific contentment of a child whose morning had begun correctly. The house was quiet. It was the quiet of a held breath, which Mariella recognized and did not mistake for peace. Madame Suja emerged at 11. She was dressed with her usual precision. She moved through the ground floor with her usual authority. She passed Mariella in the corridor near the kitchen without acknowledging her. Not the studied not seeing of the previous 6 weeks, but something different. Something that was aware of her and choosing, with deliberateness, not to engage. Mariella noted the difference and said nothing. Sang-yun appeared at his mother's sitting room door at 11:30. Mariella was at the end of the corridor, reviewing Jiho's school reading list. Close enough to be aware of the conversation, if not its content. She did not move closer. She did not need to. The conversation was short. Less than 10 minutes. She heard its rhythm without its words. Sang-yun's voice, level and continuous, not rising. Madame Suja's, with the tight controlled quality of someone receiving information they are not accepting but cannot argue with. When Sang-yun came out, he did not look down the corridor at Mariella. He went back to his office. But he left the sitting room door slightly open, which she understood was not an accident. She passed it an hour later. Madame Suja was at her window, looking at the walled garden. She did not turn around, but she spoke. Your mother's name was Clara, she said. In English. The first English Mariella had ever heard from her. Mariella stopped. She was very determined, Madame Suja said. Studying that language every evening, as though she had decided to take something from this house that couldn't be taken from her. A pause. I found that threatening. At the time. Another pause, longer. I find many things threatening that I perhaps should not. It was not an apology. It was not close to an apology. It was something smaller and in some ways more significant. It was a woman of 62, who had never in her life been required to account for herself to someone she considered below her, producing the thinnest edge of an accounting. Mariella stood in the doorway for a moment. She never said a bad word about this household, Mariella said. My mother. Not one. She talked about the garden and the cold and your husband's dictionary. She talked about a boy who was going to run this family one day, and she hoped he would grow into his father's goodness. She paused. I think he has. I think you know that too. Madame Suja said nothing, but she did not tell her to leave. Mariella walked on. That afternoon, Sang-Yun found her in the garden where she was waiting for Jiho's school car. He sat on the low stone bench where she usually sat, which required him to adjust his posture in a way that was mildly undignified, and which he accepted without comment. She sat beside him. What did you tell her? Mariella asked. That you are the nanny for my son, he said. That you will remain the nanny for my son for as long as you choose to be, and that the arrangement of who sits where at my table is mine to determine. A pause. I also told her about the box. Mariella looked at him. How did she receive that? Quietly, he said, which is how she receives things she has no argument against. He looked at the garden. She intercepted my father's letter because she was afraid of what it represented. She has been afraid of a great many things for a very long time. It has made her cruel in ways she doesn't fully understand as cruelty. He paused. That's not an excuse. It's a context. I know the difference, Mariella said. I know you do. The school car came through the gate and Jiho emerged from it with the contained energy of a child who has been patient for 7 hours and is now done being patient. He spotted them both on the bench and his face did what it always did. That total, uncalculating brightness. And he ran across the garden and inserted himself between them on the bench with the complete physical confidence of a child who has decided that a space belongs to him. You're both here, he said, with deep satisfaction, as though this were a thing he had arranged. We're both here, Mariella confirmed. Jiho reached into his school bag and produced a piece of paper. A drawing, in the careful, deliberate lines of a child who takes art seriously. 3 figures on a bench. One tall, one small, in the middle, with what appeared to be a pebble in his hand. That's us, he said, unnecessarily. I can see that, Sang-Yun said. He looked at the drawing for a long moment, with the expression that Mariella had now seen on him 3 times and had stopped trying to name because the names she had kept finding for it were names she was not yet ready to use. Jiho put the drawing on Mariella's knee, which was apparently where it was meant to live, and went to examine the rosebush for interesting developments. The garden was the color of late autumn, the particular gold and amber of things that were ending and ending beautifully. He drew you into the picture, Mariella said. Yes, Sang-Yun said. He doesn't usually draw people he's uncertain about. No, Sang-Yun said. He doesn't. A pause that was not uncomfortable. The specific ease of 2 people who have been through enough together in a short time that silence between them has stopped being a gap and started being a place. My father believed, Sang-Yun said, that the most important things in a person's life arrived when they were not looking for them and stayed only if the person had the sense to stop moving long enough to recognize them. He looked at the garden. He was usually right. He sounds like my mother, Mariella said. He would have been delighted to hear that, Sang-Yun said. Jiho called from the rosebush. There are new buds. In October. That's not supposed to happen. No, Mariella called back. It's not. Maybe it doesn't know what's supposed to happen, Jiho said, with the authority of a child who has considered this and found it to be the only satisfying explanation. Sang-Yun looked at his son, then at Mariella. Something moved through his expression, the same thing she had seen on the 4th floor, less private this time, less directed at the floor. She looked back. The garden held them all in its October gold, and the rosebush put out its impossible buds, and somewhere in the house above them Madame Suja sat with the weight of an old interception and the slow, difficult beginning of something that was not quite reckoning, but was in that direction. This was not the end of any of it. Sang-Yun's world had enemies who did not yet know about Mariella, and would move when they did. Madame Suja was a woman whose fear made her dangerous in ways that a single conversation did not resolve. The box on the fourth floor held 6 more letters that Mariella had not yet fully read and Sang-yun had not yet seen. But Jiho had drawn all 3 of them on a bench. And the rosebush, which did not know what was supposed to happen, was blooming anyway. End of part 1. Dae-sung Lim wrote a letter to a 13-year-old girl and told her she was always welcome at his table. His son gave her the chair without knowing any of it. Some things do not need to be arranged. They simply arrive, exactly where they were always meant to be. Madame Suja told her she was too dark to sit at the table. Sang-yun pulled out his own chair. And somewhere on the 4th floor, in a cedar-smelling room, a dead man's letter had been waiting 14 years to be found by exactly the right person. Dae-sung Lim never met Mariella Thomas, but he knew she was coming. He made space for her before she was old enough to find her way here. And his son, who knew none of it, honored that space without knowing it existed. Jiho drew all 3 of them on a bench. The rosebush bloomed in October. Subscribe. Because there are 6 letters still in that box that nobody has read yet. Because Madame Suja's fear is old and old fear does not resolve in one conversation. And because what Sang-yun does when he finally reads every word his father wrote, about Clara, about Mariella, about the kind of woman he hoped would one day find her way into his son's world, is going to be the most important moment in this entire story. And we haven't shown it to you yet. Real talk. Question 1, the chair question. Sang-yun gave Mariella his seat at the head of the table. Not a spare chair. His chair, in front of his mother, his family, and his entire organization. Was that the moment he made a decision about her? Or had he already decided, long before that dinner? Question 2, the patience question. Mariella understood every word Madame Suja said in Korean from the very first morning. She said nothing for 6 weeks. Was that wisdom, or did she wait too long? Question 3, the letter question. Chairman Lim wrote to a 13-year-old girl he had never met and told her she was always welcome at his table. Madame Suja received that letter and buried it for 14 years. If Mariella had received it as a child, do you think she still would have come? Question 4, the pebble question. Jiho placed his oldest, most carefully kept pebble beside Mariella's chopsticks at that dinner table. He is 6 years old, and he has never been wrong about a person yet. What do you think he already understands about Mariella and his father that neither of them has admitted to themselves?